Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Really happy you're back with me. We're going to continue reading in our book, Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So she lived a long time ago, long time ago, more than 100 years. And things were a little different then than they are now. Things are even different from when I was a kid to now. So people, at least where she lived, and the majority of people did not have much money. And so for holidays and stuff, they didn't spend a lot of money like sometimes people do now. I'm going to read about Christmas. It looks like they have snow at Christmas. Christmas was coming. The little log house was almost buried in snow. Great drifts were banked against the walls and windows, and in the morning, when Pa opened the door, there was a wall of snow as high as Laura's head. Now, a drift of snow is where the wind has blown the snow up against something, like a wall, and so it can't go any farther, so it just builds up and up and up. Pa took the shovel and shoveled it away. And then he shoveled a path to the barn, where the horses and cows were snug and warm in their stalls. The days were clear and bright. Laura and Mary stood on their chairs by the window and looked out at the glistening snow on the glittering trees. Snow was piled all along the bare, dark branches, and it sparkled in the sunshine. Icicles hung from the eaves of the house. That's the part of the house that comes off the roof. Great icicles as large as the top of Laura's arm. They were like glass and full of sharp lights. Pa's breath hung in the air like smoke. Have you ever been out when it's so cold you can go whew, and you see just smoke? I have. When he came along the path from the barn, he breathed out in clouds and it froze in white frost on his mustache and beard. Now, that happens to my sons when they're out in the cold, especially Stephen, and when Daniel was living in a very cold place, it happened to him too. When he came in, stomping the snow from his boots and caught Laura up in a big bear hug against his cold big coat, his mustache was beaded with little drops of melting frost. Every night he was busy, working on a large piece of board and two small pieces. He whittled them with his knife and rubbed them with sandpaper and with the palm of his hand until when Laura touched, they felt very soft and smooth as silk. Then, with his sharp jackknife, he worked at them, cutting the edges of one large one into little peaks and towers, with a large star carved at the very tallest point. He cut little holes in the wood. He cut the holes in the shape of windows and little stars and crescent moons and circles. All around them he carved tiny leaves, flowers, and birds. One of the little boards he shaped in a lovely curve, and around its edge he carved leaves and flowers and stars, and through it he cut crescent moons and curlicues. That's like a little shape that goes like this. Around the edges of the smallest board, he carved a tiny flowering vine. He made the tiniest shavings, cutting very slowly and carefully, making whatever he thought would be pretty. At last, he fitted the pieces together. When this was done, the large piece was a beautifully carved back for a smooth little shelf across its middle. The large star was at the very top of it. The curved piece supported the shelf underneath, and it was beautifully carved too, and the little vine ran around the edge of the shelf. Pa made this bracket for a Christmas present for Ma. He hung it very carefully in the log wall against the windows, between the windows, and Ma stood her little China woman on the shelf. The little China woman had a china bonnet, that's a hat, on her head, and china curls hung down her china neck. Her china dress was laced across the front, and she wore a pink china apron and little gilt china shoes. That means they looked golden in color. She was beautiful, standing on the shelf with flowers and leaves and birds and moons carved all around her, and the very large star at the top. Ma was busy all day long cooking good things for Christmas. She baked salt raisin bread and rye and Indian bread and Swedish crackers and a huge pan of baked beans with salt pork and molasses. She baked vinegar pies. Now, I've never tried a vinegar pie. I think it might be a little bit like a lemon pie. And dried apple pies, and filled a big jar with cookies. And she let Laura and Mary lick the cake spoon. One morning, she boiled molasses and sugar together until they made a thick syrup. And Pa brought in 2 pans of clean white snow from outdoors. Laura and Mary each had a pan, and Pa and Ma showed them how to pour the dark syrup into little streams into the snow. They made circles and curlicues and squiggly things, and these hardened at once and were candy. Laura and Mary might eat 1 piece each, but the rest was saved for Christmas Day. And here are the girls making it. All of this was done because Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins, Peter and Alice and Ella, were coming to spend Christmas. The day before Christmas, they came. Laura and Mary heard the gay ringing of the sleigh bells, growing louder and louder every moment. And then the big bobsled came out. Oh, my hair's blowing in my face. Came out of the woods and drove up to the gate. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins were in it, all covered up under blankets and robes and buffalo skins. See, they were in an open wagon where all that cold air was around them, not in cars and pickups like we are now, where we're closed in and have a heater. They didn't have that. They were wrapped up in so many coats and mufflers and veils and shawls, they looked like big shapeless bundles. When they all came in, the little house was full and running over. Black Susan the cat ran out and hid in the barn, but Jack leaped in circles through the snow, barking as though he would never stop. Now there were cousins to play with. As soon as Aunt Eliza had unwrapped them, Peter and Alice and Ella and Laura and Mary began to run and shout. At last, Aunt Eliza told them to be quiet. Then Alice said, "I'll tell you what let's do. Let's make pictures." Alice said they must go outdoors to do it, and Ma thought it was too cold for Laura to play outdoors. But when she saw how disappointed Laura was, she said she might go after all for a little while. She put on Laura's coat and mittens and her warm cape with the hood and wrapped a muffler around her neck and let her go out. Laura had never had so much fun. All morning she played outdoors in the snow with Alice and Ella and Peter and Mary, making pictures. The way they did it was this. Each one by herself climbed up on a stump. That's where you cut a tree down and left the stump. And then all at once, holding their arms out wide, they fell off the stumps into the soft, deep snow. They fell flat on their faces. Then they tried to get up without spoiling the marks they made when they fell. If they did it well, there in the snow were 5 holes, shaped almost exactly like 4 little girls and a boy, arms, legs, and all. They called these their pitchers. Sometimes people move their arms up and down when they're in it, and they call them snow angels. Here's what the kids looked like. Let's see their shadows, or their pictures. They played so hard all day that when night came, they were too excited to sleep. But they must sleep, or Santa Claus could not come. So they hung their stockings by the fireplace, said their prayers, and they went to bed. Alice, Ella, Mary, and Laura all in one big bed on the floor. Peter had the trundle bed. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter were going to sleep in the big bed, and another bed was made on the attic floor for Pa and Ma. The buffalo robes, that was made out of buffalo skins, and all the blankets had been brought in from Uncle Peter's shed, so there were enough covers for everyone. Pa and Ma and Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter sat by the fire talking, and just as Laura was drifting off to sleep, she heard Uncle Peter say, "Eliza had a narrow squeak the other day when I was away at Lake City. You know Prince, that big dog of mine?" Laura was wide awake now. She always liked to hear about dogs. She lay still as a mouse and looked at the fire flickering on the log walls and listened to Uncle Peter. And here's what she looked like. Can you see that? "Well," Uncle Peter said, "early in the morning, Eliza started to the spring to get a pail of water, and Prince was following her. She got to the edge of the ravine where the path goes down to the spring, and all of a sudden, Prince set his teeth in the back of her skirt, and he pulling her. You know what a big dog he is. Ella scolded him, but he wouldn't let go, and he's so big and strong, she couldn't get away from him. He kept backing and pulling till he tore a piece out of her skirt. It was my blueprint," Aunt Ella said to Ma. "Dear me," Ma said. "He tore a big piece right out of the back of it." Aunt Eliza said, "I was so mad I could have whipped him for it, but he growled at me." "Prince growled at you?" Pa said. "Yes," said Aunt Eliza. "So when she started on again towards the spring," Uncle Peter went on, "but Prince jumped in the path ahead of her. He snarled at her. He paid no attention to her talking and scolding. He just kept showing his teeth and snarling. And when she tried to get past him, he kept in front of her and snapped at her. That scared her." "I would think it would," said Ma. "He was so savage, I thought he was going to bite me," said Aunt Eliza. "I believe he would have." "I never heard of such a thing," said Ma. "What on earth did you do?" "I turned right around and ran into the house where the children were and slammed the door," Aunt Eliza answered. "Of course, Prince was savage with strangers," said Uncle Peter. "But he was always so kind to Eliza and the children, I felt perfectly safe to leave them with him." Eliza couldn't understand it at all. After she got into the house, he kept prancing around it and growling. Every time she started to open the door, he jumped at her and snarled. "Had he gone mad?" said Ma. "That's what I thought," Aunt Eliza said. "I didn't know what to do. There I was, shut up in the house with the children and not daring to go out, and we didn't even have any water." Because back then they didn't have water in their house. They had to pack it by pails. "I couldn't even get any snow to melt. Every time I opened the door so much as a crack, Prince acted like he was going to tear me to pieces." "How long did this go on?" Pa asked. "All day. till late in the afternoon," Aunt Eliza said. "Peter'd taken his gun or I would have shot him." Along late in the afternoon, Uncle Peter said he got quiet and lay down in front of the door. Aunt Eliza thought he was asleep, and she made her mind up that she was going to slip past him to get to the spring for some water. So she opened the door very quietly. But of course he woke up right away. And when he saw she had the pail in her hand, he got up and walked ahead of her to the spring, just like he normally does. And there, all around the spring in the snow, were fresh tracks of a panther. Remember, that's what we call a cougar. "The tracks were as big as my hand," said Aunt Eliza. "Yes," Uncle Peter said, "he was a big feller. His tracks were the biggest I ever saw. He would have got Eliza for sure if Prince had let her go to the spring that morning. I saw the tracks. He had been lying in that big oak over the spring, waiting for some animal to come there for water. Undoubtedly, he would have dropped down on her." Night was coming when she saw the tracks, and she didn't waste any time getting back to the house with her pail of water. Prince followed close behind, looking back into the ravine now and then. "I took him with me into the house," Aunt Eliza said, "and we all stayed inside until Peter came home." "Did you get him?" Pa asked Uncle Peter. "No," Uncle Peter said. "I took my gun and hunted all around the place, but I couldn't find him. I saw more of his tracks. He'd gone on north, farther into the big woods." Aunt Alice and Elijah and Mary were all awake now, and Laura put her head under the covers and whispered to Alice, "My, weren't you scared?" Alice whispered back that she was scared, but Ella was scareder. And Ella whispered that she wasn't either any such thing. "Well, anyway, you made more fuss about being thirsty," Alice whispered. They lay there whispering about it until Ma said, "Charles, those children will never go to sleep unless you play for them." So Pa got up and got his fiddle. The room was still warm and full of firelight. Ma's shadow and Aunt Eliza's and Uncle Peter's were big and quivering on the walls in the flickering firelight, and Pa's fiddle sang merrily to itself. He sang "Money Musk" and "The Red Heifer," "The Devil's Dream," and "The Arkansas Traveler," and Laura went to sleep while Pa and the fiddle were both softly singing, "My darling Nellie has gone, oh, they have taken away, and never more will I see my darling." In the morning, they all woke up at the same moment. They looked in their stockings, and something was in them. Santa Claus had been there. Alice and Ella and Laura in their red flannel nightgowns, and Peter in his red flannel nightshirt, all ran shouting to see what he'd brought. In each stocking there was a pair of bright red mittens, and there was a long flat stick of red and white striped peppermint candy, all beautifully notched along the side. They were so happy. They could hardly speak at first. They just looked with shining eyes at those lovely Christmas presents. But Laura was the happiest of all. Now here's a picture, one picture. See the mittens? And here's the picture. Laura had a rag doll. She was a beautiful doll. She had a face of white cloth with black button eyes. A black pencil had made her eyebrows and her cheeks, and her mouth was with red ink made from pokeberries. Her hair was black yarn that had been knitted and raveled so that it was curly. That's kind of like what I did with my hair when I braided it. She had made little red flannel stockings and little black cloth gaiters for shoes, and her dress was pretty pink and blue calico. She was so beautiful that Laura could not even say a word. She just held on to her tight and forgot everything else. She did not know that everyone was looking at her till Aunt Eliza said, "Did you ever see such big eyes?" The other girls were not jealous because Laura had mittens and candy and a doll, because Laura was the littlest girl, except baby Carrie, and Aunt Eliza's little baby, Dolly Varden. The babies were too small for dolls. They were so small they did not even know about Santa Claus. They just put their fingers in their mouths and wiggled with it because of all the excitement. Laura sat down on the edge of the bed and held her doll. She loved her red mittens and she loved her candy. She loved her doll best of all. She named her Charlotte. Then they all looked at each other's mittens and tried them on, and Peter bit a large piece out of his stick of candy, but Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura licked theirs to make it last longer. "Well, well," Uncle Peter said, "isn't there even one stocking with nothing but a switch in it? My, have you all been such good children?" But they didn't believe that Santa Claus could really have given any of them nothing but a switch. That happened to some children, but it couldn't happen to them. It was so hard to be good all the time, every day for a whole year. "You mustn't tease the children, Peter," Aunt Eliza said. Ma said, "Laura, aren't you going to let the other girls hold your doll?" She meant little girls should not be selfish. So Laura let Mary take the beautiful doll, and then Alice held her a minute, and then Ella. They smoothed the pretty dress and admired the red flannel stockings and the gaiters and the curly woven hair. But Laura was glad when at last Charlotte was back in her arms again. Peter and Uncle and Pa had each a pair of new warm mittens, knit in little squares of red and white. Ma and Aunt Eliza had made them. Aunt Eliza had brought Laura a large red apple stuck full of cloves. Oh, it smelled so good. And it would not spoil, for so many cloves would keep it sweet and sound. Ma gave Aunt Eliza a little needle book she had made with bits of silk for covers and soft white flannel leaves into which to stick the needles. The flannel would keep the needles from rusting because, see, they had to sew everything that they had. They didn't just go to stores and buy things like we do now, like clothing. They all admired Ma's beautiful bracket, and Aunt Eliza said that Uncle Peter had made one for her, of course, with different carvings. Santa Claus had not given them anything at all. Santa Claus did not give grown-up people presents. But that was not because they weren't good. Pa and Ma were good. It was because they were grown-up, and grown-up people must give each other presents. Then all the presents must be laid away for a little while. Peter went out with Pa and Uncle Peter to do the chores, and Alice and Ella helped Aunt Eliza make the beds, and Laura and Mary set the table while Ma got breakfast. For breakfast, there were pancakes, and Ma made a pancake man for each one of the children. Have either of your parents ever made you pancakes shaped like people? I've made them for my children and grandchildren, sometimes even like a dog, and one time I made it like a bird. Ma called each one in turn to bring their plate, and each could stand by the stove and watch while, with the spoon full of batter, Ma put on the arms and legs and the head. It was exciting to watch her turn the whole little man over, quickly and carefully on the hot griddle. When it was done, she put it smoking hot on the plate. Peter ate the head off his man right away. But Alice and Ella and Mary ate theirs slowly in little bits. First the arms and legs, and then the middle, saving the head for last. Today, the weather was so cold they could not play outdoors. But there were the new mittens to admire and the candy to lick. And they all sat on the floor together and looked in the pictures in the Bible and the pictures of all kinds of animals and birds in Pa's big green book. See, that's another change from then to now. Now we have lots of books. I have lots of books. But back then, they didn't have a lot of books. And so Pa and Ma only owned two, the Bible and Pa's big green book. Laura kept Charlotte in her arms the whole time. Then there was the Christmas dinner. Alice and Ella and Peter and Mary and Laura did not say a word at the table, for they knew that children should be seen and not heard. I want to show you what they looked like. See how long the stockings were? All the way up the legs. But they did not need to ask for second helpings. Ma and Aunt Eliza kept their plates full and let them eat all the good things they could hold. At your house, are you allowed to talk at the table? I let my children talk at the table. But if there were a lot of adults, they had to learn to wait their turn. But back then, children were not allowed to talk at the table. Christmas comes but once a year, said Aunt Eliza. Dinner was early because Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins had such a long way to go home. Best the horses can do, Uncle Peter said. We'll hardly make it home before dark. So as soon as they'd eaten dinner, Uncle Peter and Pa went to put the horses on the sled while Ma and Aunt Eliza wrapped up the cousins. They pulled heavy wooden stockings over the woolen stockings and the shoes they were already wearing. They put on mittens and coats and warm hoods and shawls and wrapped mufflers around their necks and thick wooden veils over their faces. Ma slipped piping hot baked potatoes in their pockets to keep their fingers warm. That's a good idea. And Aunt Eliza's flat irons were hot on the stove, ready to put their feet on the sled. So a flat iron was a flat, probably circle shape with a handle. And they would put that on the stove and they would get it hot, and then they could put it at the bottom of the sled, and everybody could put their feet on it. And that's how they kept their feet warm. The blankets and quilts and buffalo robes were warmed up too. So they all got to the big bobsled, cozy and warm, and Pa tucked the last robe well in around them. Goodbye, goodbye, they called, and off they went, the horses trotting gaily and the sleigh bells ringing. In just a little while, the merry sound of the bells was gone. Christmas was over, but what a happy Christmas it had been. Well, that sounds like a fun Christmas to me. You have to think about some of the things you do around Christmas time if you celebrate Christmas. Some people celebrate Hanukkah or another holiday. And try to remember that, because those are times of special celebration. Well, this is Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I love you, I really do. But even more importantly, God loves you, and He always will. So I want to pray blessings on you and yours